Before we begin, let me ask you a question that reaches beyond the surface of your life. What if the problem is not that God is absent, but that our eyes have been trained not to see Him? From the beginning of time, the world has been speaking, moments have been signaling, patterns have been forming. Yet the human mind has learned to rush, to filter, to ignore the divine fingerprints all around it. We wake up, we work, we worry, and we wonder why heaven feels silent. But what if heaven has never stopped speaking? What if every delay, every interruption, every blessing, and even every battle was carrying a message? Tonight, this is not about religion, routine, or theory. This is about retraining the mind, reawakening the vision, and learning to see God not only in the miraculous, but in the ordinary, not only in the mountaintop, but in the valley, not only in answered prayers, but in the waiting itself. There are moments when heaven speaks, not with thunder, not with fire, but with a whisper tied to a specific time, a specific instruction, and a specific people. And those moments determine outcomes far greater than we realize, because God does not only work in events, He works in timing. And when the instruction is connected to a day, it is never random. It is never symbolic only. It is never poetic alone. It is precise, intentional, and protective. And throughout history, whenever judgment passed through, whenever calamity moved, whenever a separating line was drawn between destruction and deliverance, there was always a command connected to staying, to remaining, to not going out, to abiding under covering, because movement outside of divine instruction has always carried consequences, even for those who believe they are chosen, because being chosen does not cancel the need for obedience, and being called does not exempt one from timing. And Wednesday is not mentioned because of superstition, but because God often marks days the way He marks doors, and when a day is marked, it becomes a threshold. And thresholds are dangerous places to ignore, because a threshold is where protection ends and exposure begins. And the chosen ones have always been protected not by strength, but by submission, not by knowledge, but by obedience, not by understanding, but by trust. And when the instruction is to stay inside, it is not a punishment, it is a covering, it is not confinement, it is preservation. Because what happens outside is not meant for those inside. And what passes through is not assigned to those who remain. And many think faith means movement, but sometimes faith means stillness. Sometimes faith means staying put when every instinct says go, when every emotion says leave, when every voice says nothing will happen. Because the greatest danger has always been assuming nothing will happen, and the greatest losses in Scripture did not come from rebellion alone, but from partial obedience. From delayed obedience, from obedience that reasoned itself out of alignment, because reason will always ask why, but obedience asks when. And when God speaks of a day, He is asking for trust beyond logic, because logic cannot see what is scheduled, and logic cannot perceive what is passing by unseen. And there are movements in the spiritual realm that do not announce themselves, that do not make noise, that do not warn twice. They simply move. And those who are exposed encounter what was never meant for them. And those who are covered never even know what passed by. And that is the mercy of God, that sometimes He does not show you what He saved you from. Because if you saw it, fear would replace faith, and obedience would turn into panic. And Wednesday becomes a test not of belief but of surrender. Because the chosen are not chosen to act independently. They are chosen to hear and obey. And throughout sacred history, staying inside was the difference between life and loss, between preservation and regret. Because when destruction passed through, it did not knock on doors marked for protection, and it did not argue with those who stayed. It simply passed by, and the danger was never inside the house. The danger was always outside during the appointed time. And many underestimate timing, but timing is where prophecy lives. Timing is where instruction becomes survival, and timing is where heaven intersects earth. And when God says do not leave, it is not about fear of the outside, it is about trust in the inside, because the house becomes more than walls. It becomes a sanctuary, a covering, a boundary drawn by obedience. And when you step outside of that boundary, you step into something you were never assigned to face. And the chosen are not immune to consequences. They are protected by alignment, and alignment requires restraint, and restraint is one of the hardest forms of faith, because it feels passive, it feels unnecessary, it feels excessive, but restraint has always been the language of preservation, because what you avoid can be as important as what you confront, and what you stay away from can shape your future as much as what you pursue. And Wednesday is not about the calendar, it is about the command. And the command is about trust. And trust is about believing that God sees what you cannot see, that He knows what you do not know, and that He schedules protection before danger ever arrives. And many only recognize the danger after it has passed. But the chosen are warned before, not because they are better, but because they are listening. And listening demands humility, because humility accepts instruction without explanation. And obedience does not wait for evidence, it responds to voice. And when heaven speaks, it is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, specific, and easy to dismiss. And those are the instructions most people regret ignoring, because the simplest command often carries the greatest protection. And staying inside when told is not weakness, it is wisdom, and wisdom has always been the shield of the chosen. Because wisdom knows that safety is not always where movement is. Sometimes safety is where patience is, and patience is not delay, it is alignment with timing, and timing is everything when heaven is involved. Because heaven does not rush, and it does not waste moments, and every instruction is given for a reason that may only be understood later. And later understanding does not change earlier consequences, which is why obedience must come first, and understanding can follow. And the chosen ones are not called to test instructions. They are called to trust them, because testing comes from doubt, and trust comes from relationship, and relationship listens, and listening obeys, and obedience preserves. And preservation is the mercy hidden inside the command to stay. From the beginning, God has never left His people without a pattern, and the pattern has always revealed how protection works long before danger appears. Because God does not react to chaos, He anticipates it, and when He anticipates it, He establishes shelter, boundaries, and instructions that seem ordinary until the moment they become critical. And the chosen ones have always survived, not because they were stronger, faster, or wiser, but because they were positioned correctly under divine covering. And covering has always required a place, a boundary, a space where obedience creates separation. Because separation is not abandonment, separation is preservation. And throughout sacred history, whenever judgment moved, there was always a distinction made between those who were inside the place of shelter and those who were outside it, because the danger never needed to identify the righteous. It only needed to recognize the boundary, and boundaries are established by obedience, not emotion, not fear, not understanding, because understanding often comes too late, and emotion is unreliable when pressure rises. But obedience creates a line that cannot be crossed by what is not assigned to you. And the pattern reveals that God shelters before He strikes. He warns before He allows. He covers before He corrects. And those who understand the pattern do not argue with the instruction, because arguing means you have not recognized the pattern. And the chosen are not those who know the most, but those who recognize the pattern and align themselves with it, because the pattern is consistent even when the circumstances change. And the pattern has always included staying, remaining, abiding, dwelling, because protection is not found in movement, but in placement. And placement is everything in the kingdom of God, because being chosen does not mean you are safe everywhere. It means you are safe where God places you. And when He says remain, He is positioning you under something unseen, because divine shelter is rarely visible, and that is why it is often underestimated, because humans trust what they can see, but God hides protection in obedience so that faith remains necessary. And when the pattern is revealed, it always shows that calamity does not roam randomly, it moves with assignment. And that assignment does not include those who are under covering, and covering is never accidental, it is intentional, and intentional covering always requires cooperation. Because God does not force people to stay, He instructs them to stay, and instruction tests trust, because trust is proven not when the instruction makes sense, but when it does not. And the pattern shows that those who ignored the instruction were not always evil, rebellious, or faithless. Many were curious, many were confident, many believed they would be fine, because danger had not yet arrived, and the absence of immediate consequences has always been the greatest test of obedience, because when nothing happens right away, people assume nothing will happen at all, and that assumption has always been costly, because the pattern shows that timing is delayed on purpose, so that obedience can be proven without pressure, because pressure reveals fear, but delay reveals trust, and God watches not only how we act under threat, but how we act before it, because obedience before danger is what qualifies someone as chosen, not knowledge after the fact. And the pattern also reveals that shelter is often ordinary, a house, a room, a door, a boundary that looks no different from any other, because God does not always change the structure. He changes the status, and once a place is marked by obedience, it becomes something more than it appears. It becomes a sanctuary, a refuge, a line of mercy drawn in time, and those outside see only walls, but those inside are under covering. And the pattern shows that destruction does not negotiate with boundaries, it respects them, because boundaries are authorized by heaven, and heaven does not need to explain itself to earth. And when the chosen remain inside the pattern, they may not even be aware of what passes by, because protection is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not display what it stopped. And that silence is part of God's mercy, because fear would distort trust if we saw everything we were saved from. And the pattern also reveals that leaving shelter prematurely is as dangerous as never entering it, because timing matters as much as position. And many have obeyed partially, entered briefly, stayed for a while, but left too soon, assuming the danger had passed, assuming the instruction had expired, assuming they could decide when it was safe. But the pattern shows that safety is not determined by perception, it is determined by release. And release comes from God alone, because only He knows when the assignment has ended. And the chosen do not leave because they are restless. They wait because they are trusting. And waiting has always been the posture of those who survive divine transitions, because transitions are unstable moments where exposure is deadly, and the pattern reveals that obedience creates insulation, insulation from panic, from confusion, from unnecessary loss. And the chosen ones are not protected from everything, but they are protected from what is not meant for them. And that distinction matters, because not every storm is yours to face, not every battle is yours to fight, and not every event is yours to experience. And the pattern of divine shelter ensures that what is assigned to pass through does not touch what is assigned to remain. And remaining is not inactivity, it is alignment. And alignment is active faith, because it resists the urge to move ahead of God. And the pattern shows that impatience has always been the enemy of protection, because impatience creates exposure, and exposure invites what obedience would have blocked. And the chosen ones who understand the pattern do not mock the instruction. They do not spiritualize their way around it. They do not reinterpret it to fit comfort, because they know the pattern has never failed. And what failed were those who assumed they were exempt from it. And exemption is the language of pride, not faith, because faith knows it needs covering. And humility accepts shelter without shame. And the pattern reveals that God's mercy is often hidden inside restraint, because restraint keeps you within the boundary of blessing. And blessing is not always expansion. Sometimes blessing is preservation, and preservation does not look impressive, but it is powerful, because what is preserved can be used later, and what is lost cannot be recovered. And the chosen ones are not chosen for spectacle, they are chosen for survival, because survival allows fulfillment, and fulfillment requires obedience through hidden seasons. And the pattern of divine shelter has always protected the future by restricting the present, because God values what is coming more than what feels urgent now. And those who understand the pattern accept the restriction, because they trust the future. And trust is proven when staying is harder than leaving, and when waiting is harder than acting, and when obedience feels unnecessary, yet is obeyed anyway. There comes a moment when obedience collides with logic, and that collision reveals what truly governs the heart, because logic will always demand explanation, evidence, and reassurance, while obedience responds to voice alone. And the chosen ones have always been identified not by how much they understood, but by how quickly they obeyed when understanding was absent. because divine instruction is rarely designed to satisfy reason. It is designed to test trust, and when God speaks a command that seems illogical, untimely, or excessive, it exposes whether faith is rooted in relationship or convenience, because convenience obeys when it agrees, but relationship obeys even when it does not. And throughout sacred history, the greatest acts of preservation came from decisions that made no sense at the time, because heaven sees what earth cannot, and logic is limited to what is visible, measurable, and familiar, but God operates in realms that logic cannot access, which is why obedience must override logic if protection is to remain intact. And the chosen often struggle at this point, not because they lack faith, but because faith is being asked to surrender control, and control is what logic clings to, because logic wants predictability, safety it can explain, outcomes it can calculate. But divine obedience steps into uncertainty, knowing that certainty is found not in outcomes, but in alignment, and alignment has always been the true source of safety. Because safety is not the absence of danger, it is the presence of God's will. And when obedience overrides logic, it places the chosen under authority rather than assumption, because assumption decides based on feeling, timing, and probability, but authority decides based on instruction. And instruction carries weight even when it feels unreasonable. And many have lost protection not through rebellion, but through reasoning themselves out of obedience, because reasoning sounds wise, spiritual, and responsible, yet it subtly replaces trust with self-reliance, and self-reliance has always been dangerous in moments of divine instruction, because it assumes human judgment is sufficient to navigate what has already been scheduled in the unseen. And the unseen cannot be calculated, predicted, or avoided through logic alone, which is why obedience becomes the only defense. And obedience that overrides logic is not blind, it is anchored, because it anchors itself in the character of God, rather than the clarity of circumstances. And those who know God obey Him even when the instruction feels strange, because familiarity with His voice produces confidence in His intent, and intent matters more than explanation, because explanation may come later. But intent is trusted now, and when logic protests, it often sounds reasonable, asking why now, why this day, why this restriction, why this delay. But obedience does not argue with timing, because timing belongs to God, and those who override logic understand that divine timing often looks illogical precisely because it is preventative, not reactive, and prevention rarely makes sense until the threat appears. And by then it is too late to obey, and many only understand the value of obedience after witnessing the consequences of disobedience. But understanding after loss does not restore what was lost. And the chosen are not called to learn through loss. They are called to learn through listening, and listening requires silencing logic when it challenges instruction, not when it serves it, because logic can support obedience, but it must never lead it. And when logic leads, obedience follows only if it agrees, and that is not obedience at all. That is negotiation, and God does not negotiate His instructions, He gives them. And those who obey fully are those who trust that God's view is higher, broader, and deeper than their own. And overriding logic does not mean abandoning wisdom. It means recognizing the limits of human wisdom, because wisdom begins with acknowledging what you do not know, and what you cannot see, and what you cannot control. And the chosen ones who survive divine transitions are those who accept that they are not required to understand everything they are asked to obey, and that acceptance produces peace even when logic is unsettled, because peace is not produced by clarity, it is produced by trust, and trust grows when obedience is practiced without explanation. And the more obedience overrides logic, the stronger trust becomes. And the stronger trust becomes, the less logic needs to argue, because experience confirms what reasoning could not prove. And many instructions are given not to make sense, but to reveal who will trust without sense, because those are the ones God can entrust with greater things, because greater things require greater trust, and greater trust requires surrender of control. And control is what logic fears losing. And when the chosen surrender control, they gain covering, because covering exists only where authority is honored. And authority is honored through obedience, not agreement, and agreement is optional. Obedience is not, and the unseen consequences of ignoring instruction often begin quietly, subtly, without immediate effect, which reinforces logic's false confidence. But delayed consequences do not mean canceled consequences, and logic often mistakes delay for safety. But obedience recognizes delay as mercy, a window to remain aligned. And when the chosen override logic, they remain within that window, protected not because they understood the danger, but because they trusted the instruction. And that trust becomes a testimony not spoken, but lived, because obedience that overrides logic reshapes the future without ever announcing how much it prevented. And the chosen may never know what logic would have led them into. And that is the grace of obedience, that it hides the disaster by preventing it, and prevents the lesson by preserving the life. And obedience does not seek recognition, because its reward is survival, alignment, and continuity. And continuity is what allows destiny to unfold, because destiny cannot unfold where logic insists on control, and only obedience that overrides logic can carry someone safely through moments where explanation is withheld and trust is required. There are consequences that announce themselves loudly, and there are consequences that arrive silently, unseen, unfelt at first, yet altering everything beneath the surface. And the most dangerous consequences have always been the unseen ones, because what is unseen is rarely feared, rarely respected, and rarely avoided. And throughout sacred history, the greatest losses did not begin with catastrophe. They began with a step taken too early, a boundary crossed too soon, a departure made without release. Because leaving before the appointed time does not feel like rebellion. It feels reasonable, justified, even wise. And that is what makes it so dangerous, because the enemy of obedience often disguises itself as common sense, urgency, or opportunity. And the chosen ones are most vulnerable not when danger is obvious, but when nothing seems wrong, because calm environments give confidence to act independently. And independence has always preceded exposure. And exposure invites consequences that were never assigned. And when someone leaves too soon, the immediate effect is often nothing at all. No warning, no sign, no consequence. And that absence becomes confirmation in the mind that the instruction was unnecessary, excessive, or expired. But unseen consequences do not operate on human timelines. They unfold gradually, strategically, quietly, altering paths, relationships, outcomes, and protection without ever announcing their arrival. And by the time they become visible, they are already rooted. And the chosen often struggle with this truth because they expect consequences to be instant, dramatic, and obvious. But divine order does not always work that way, because God allows freedom, and freedom allows movement. And movement outside of instruction carries effects that may not appear immediately, but that does not mean they are not forming. And the unseen consequence of leaving too soon is often the loss of covering before the loss of peace, the loss of alignment before the loss of direction, and the loss of restraint before the loss of protection. And restraint is what keeps someone within the boundary of safety, because boundaries are not felt, they are respected. And when respect fades, exposure begins. And exposure is subtle at first, a shift in atmosphere, a sense of restlessness, a vulnerability that cannot be explained. And many misinterpret this as growth, transition, or calling, when in fact it is simply uncovered space. And uncovered space attracts what was never meant to find you. And what finds you there does not need permission, because permission was granted the moment instruction was ignored. And the unseen consequence of premature departure is not always destruction. Sometimes it is delay, detour, unnecessary struggle, or loss of momentum. Because destiny is sensitive to timing, and timing is sensitive to obedience. And when timing is disrupted, destiny does not disappear. It becomes harder, heavier, and more painful to reach. And many of the chosen carry burdens they were never meant to carry, simply because they arrived somewhere before they were sent. An arrival without sending creates strain, because what God sends you to will sustain you, but what you choose prematurely will drain you. And the unseen consequence often shows up as exhaustion without explanation, resistance without cause, battles that feel disproportionate, because you are fighting things that obedience would have avoided. And avoidance is not cowardice, it is wisdom. Because wisdom knows which battles are assigned and which are optional. And the chosen are not meant to fight everything. They are meant to obey everything. And obedience filters battles before they ever reach you. And when someone leaves too soon, they step into assignments that belong to another time, another season, or another person, and those assignments do not recognize your anointing, because they were never meant for you. And the unseen consequences misalignment, and misalignment erodes confidence, clarity, and peace over time. And people begin to question their calling, their faith, their worth, not realizing the issue is not who they are, but where they are standing, and where they are standing was entered prematurely. And the tragedy is that many never connect the struggle to the timing, because the decision was made days, weeks, or even years earlier. And delayed consequences disconnect cause from effect, making correction harder, because correction requires recognition. And recognition requires humility. And humility is difficult when the consequences were not immediate, and the unseen consequence also affects others. Because when one leaves too soon, it creates gaps in places they were meant to remain, and those gaps expose others, shift responsibilities, and alter outcomes beyond the individual. Because obedience is never isolated, it is communal, and timing protects more than one life at a time. And when someone exits early, they remove a covering they did not know they were providing, and that loss ripples outward quietly, affecting relationships, stability, and continuity. And the chosen often underestimate how their obedience shelters others, because shelter is invisible until it is gone, and the unseen consequence of leaving too soon is often the loss of future testimony, because the story that would have been written through patience is replaced with a story of recovery. And recovery is harder than preservation, because preservation maintains strength, but recovery rebuilds from loss, and God is merciful. He restores, He redirects, He redeems. But redemption does not erase the cost of unnecessary detours, and those detours were never required. And that is the weight of premature departure, that it creates lessons that did not need to be learned the hard way, and scars that obedience would have prevented. And the chosen are not exempt from mercy. But mercy does not cancel consequence, it redeems it, and redemption still acknowledges what was lost. And the unseen consequence also includes missed moments of divine encounter, because staying often produces revelations that leaving forfeits, and God reveals Himself in waiting in ways He does not reveal Himself in movement, because waiting strips away control, and in that space God speaks, shapes, and prepares, and leaving too soon cuts that process short, producing people who are gifted but unprepared, anointed but unstable, called but wary, because preparation was abandoned for progress, and progress without preparation is fragile, and fragility leads to collapse under pressure. And the unseen consequence is that what should have been strong becomes brittle, and what should have lasted becomes temporary. And timing is what hardens purpose into endurance, and endurance is what carries destiny through resistance. And when the chosen leave too soon, they often spend years rebuilding what patience would have finished in them quietly. And the pain is not always dramatic. It is subtle regret, recurring obstacles, a sense of being out of sync, because heaven is precise and precision matters. And when precision is ignored, alignment suffers, and suffering follows, not as punishment, but as a result. And the unseen consequence is that life becomes harder than it needed to be, heavier than it was meant to be, and obedience would have made it lighter by keeping the chosen where grace was already waiting.